few years ago, it was like when you think about application development. When I was in my 20s at university, and they told me, if you want to develop applications, then you have to use a full life cycle, application life cycle management tool, which takes your application from requirements up to deployment, all the tests, everything. Now, fast forward 20 years, and no one today is using one of these systems anymore. Probably a lot of you guys in this room don't even have heard the names that were the number one products then. So if anyone still knows about IBM Rational Rows, you can lift your hands, but probably won't be too many people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ah, look at that. So, and what I think, my opinion is that basically that same will happen in the API space and in the API management space. We won't have these large full lifecycle platforms anymore. So we will have a lot of smaller tools that are combined in different pipeline systems, different workflows to get the job done. And it's not only me that thinks like that. So that view has taken on in the industry lately. So I've collected a bunch of quotes, especially one from Eric, who's in the room. So if you want to get confirmation that my view of the world is correct, talk to Eric. He will hopefully agree with me here. But they're also the likes of like Kinlane of Postman, or even Gartner, who have told or written in their research that in the coming years, API gateways and with them the full lifecycle platforms will become a commodity. And it's happening today, right? So we see more and more gateways popping up for some niche stuff, some specialized IoT gateways, specialized gateway for this, for that. So that idea that a company has one and only one full lifecycle management platform, that is going away. That won't be happening in the future. So all of us in the industry, all of us working with APIs, we have to get used to work with different platforms, with multiple platforms. And for most of us, our API landscapes more or less looks like something like that. So you have a lot of different systems, every tool, every system taking care of a very small aspect, and you put them together to get your result, to get the API landscape that you use in your organization. Now, the problem is that while the basic idea is that everything now talks to everything, you have to make sure that this happens. So what we find with customers is mostly that they have different islands where some stuff is connected and some stuff isn't. So you have an island around, for example, internal APIs that run on an API gateway A, and all of your external public-facing APIs, they run on a system B. And those systems are not connected to each other. Now, if somebody comes along, for example, for a compliance reason or for security reasons, and just ask you a very simple question, like, what APIs do we have published? You now start hunting APIs in different systems. And worst of all, you might miss APIs. Then you have a lot of shadow APIs no one knows about, no one checks, right? So governance, big issue here. And this is where something that's called a control plane comes in. So a control plane that takes everything that needs to be executed in a centralized fashion or that needs to be known in a centralized fashion and takes care of it. So for example, you need one tool that knows about every API in the system. You need one tool that is capable of checking the security of API in your system. However, you do not need one tool, for example, to do API design. So the teams in the companies, they can use whatever they would like to use for design, right? So if they want to use Postman, fine. If they want to use something else, Insomnia or whatever, fine, do it. If they want to run it on a layer 7 gateway, do it. If they want to run it on Azure, do it. But there needs to be that one central element that is capable of discovering your APIs, of provisioning your APIs, of securing your APIs. And that's what we call a single point of truth, right? And in line with the quote of Eric, centralize what you must, right? So, and that is what centralize what you must, not more, right? So everything else, use the tool that is best for the job. But there are certain things that just don't work out if you don't centralize it. And the benefits of such a centralization, of such a control plane, those are easy to see, right? So you catalog and manage access to all of your APIs from one single platform. So your consumers don't need to hunt around different developer portals. They don't need to know in advance who to talk to get access to a certain API. It's all on that one platform. So you get increased adoption, accelerated time to value, and that usually equals to a drive in innovation. If you have one system that is capable of talking to all these other different systems, you can automate APIs on every platform. So you have only one type of pipeline, you have only one type of workflow, and that control plane just makes sure that all the translations that need to be done to get that API actually running on Azure or on AWS or in the Google Cloud, that is performed, but that's none of the business of the developers anymore. And especially if you run DevOps, that is a huge benefit because the backend developers don't need to know internals of the API platform that you're using. And of course, if you have one system that knows all your APIs, that knows the security of all your APIs, then it's far easier to be compliant, to protect your data. You can do security audits rather easily by just checking if these APIs are compliant, all within one system, and so it increases your governance and your security. So are we just needing a new tool? Are we just needing that one control plane and then everything's fine again? No, we do need to shift the perception of what is API management. API management is not strictly technical anymore. It's not only a technical necessity you have to do to publish your data. Because APIs are so important nowadays, and because there is almost no real business that is running without any use of APIs, API management needs to be promoted to a strategic topic. So C-level needs to think about this. As thorough as people nowadays think of their cloud strategy. Am I going private, public, hybrid, right? How do I do risk mitigation there? Same needs to be true for APIs. And there is an architecture pattern that basically solves that. I talked about the control plane. That is a classical multi-plane architecture we have in a lot of different parts of the IT. That's in network management and in all different kind of stuff, where you have the upper planes that basically don't need to have full information on the data plane. So for example, if you look at the upmost part, access policies, analytics, to use that, to define that, you don't need to know on what technology your API is running. It's not important. Access is access to whatever system. So basically you can split that into just two planes, and if we adopt that for the API management space, you end up with a control plane that consists of a developer portal, an administration portal, and a data plane where the actual API gateway is. And if you think that further, I said companies will end up with more gateways in the future. That means you have multiple data planes. And now the interesting thing is that your control plane is actually used to configure, to run, to monitor all those different data planes. But the processing of data, that is federated into these different data planes. And that lets you build some really cool use cases that were quite complex before, that are now rather easy. But before we get to that, the basic capabilities of such a control plane, of course, it needs to find the APIs. It needs API discovery. It needs to manage consumers. It needs to manage API keys. It needs to gather data. And it also needs to provision and migrate APIs because, as we all know, consuming APIs is only one part of the equation. Publishing APIs is the second part of the equation. And why shouldn't you use the benefits of federated API management not for publishing? So again, we're using federated API management. That solves a lot of problems for us. It brings down cost. It speeds us up. it resolves some part of that API complexity that we're dealing with, because the more APIs we have, the more complex it is, and the more API management platforms we have, that multiplies itself, right? So complexity is rising exponentially. We have to work against that. And of course, if for day-to-day operations, I just need to learn one mental model, that of the control plane, and not every mental model of every platform I use. Because honestly, if you just compare, for example, Azure and AWS, yes, they can do the same thing, but everything has a different name there. So you have to learn all the models. If you apply that federated API management architecture, you only need the mental model of the control plane, and the control plane makes sure that it adapts and translates correctly. So I was talking about some of the use cases that this enables. So we see a lot of customers that were currently only on-premise, that they move to the cloud, either in part, like new workloads are published to the cloud, and the old workloads still stay on-premise, or in more of like a shift approach, that they just lift and shift their API infrastructure to the cloud. But nonetheless, you end up with two different systems. Okay, so you end up with cloud-native gateways for your new shiny serverless workloads, and all the heavy lifting legacy on-prem stuff that gets the money in. So you can use that pattern, the federated API management pattern, and the use of a control plane to get a unified view on your APIs and build an API marketplace, an API catalog, developer portal. Is multiple names for it. The basic idea is all the same. One place where you get information about all your APIs, no matter where they are running. So for the consumer side, and also if we at the publishing side, for the publisher side, it's not relevant anymore where something lies, where something works, where it's executed. And I'd argue that for consumers, it is even bad if they need to know in advance where something is. So if I imagine I'm in a company building a new tool, and I have to check for every API I would like to use, where is it run? Who do I have to talk to get access? That brings down speed tremendously, right? And if you get it wrong, you run from one person to the next person to the next person until you finally arrive at someone who can tell you how to get access to that API. Second use case that is a quite common one we see with, at least with our customer base at Apida, is that we have group structures. So you have a central IT for the group, for the holding, and you have different business units that either were built over time, that got acquired, there might have been some mergers. So you end up with a system where you have a centralized IT and business unit ITs. And these business units, they might use different technology. So you might have one business unit that always used X-Ray, for example, and now you acquire a new company, put it into a new business unit, and they have been cloud native forever, so they only use AWS. Which means that now the central IT is quite in a dilemma. It has two options. It can either decide what to use, which basically means telling one of the business unit they can't use what they used for years and have to migrate everything, or they can take themselves out of the equation and say, okay, every business unit is responsible for itself. We can't track anything because they use like 5 different systems. We can't work with all of them. And they take their hands up and say, okay, if we can't control it, then we are not responsible for security anymore. We are not responsible for compliance anymore. We can't do governance. The business unit has to do it because they are the only ones who can look into their own systems. But that is not how you want to act as a centralized IT. Because in the first case, you're the bad guy, you're the gatekeeper. You tell people what they can't use and why they can't use that shiny new system that they just discovered and that they want to use for the next product. In the second case, you're constantly in an argument who has to look after the APIs, who has to make sure they work in a way that works for the customer, but also for the business. Who has to say, okay, I guarantee my APIs are secure. They're up to the standard. So by using that federated API management approach, centralized IT can use that control plane to look into all the different business unit API management systems. And the business units can still continue to use whatever they want as long as it can connect to that control plane. So it's a win-win for everyone. The central IT isn't the gatekeeper anymore. They're not the bad guys anymore, telling everyone they don't are allowed or they're not allowed to use this or that. They can now enable people and can say, okay, this is what we support. Do you have any other ideas? And they can guarantee governance. They can guarantee security. And one aspect, I mean, this tech conference, so probably that is the first thing people don't like to think about. Of course, you can do accounting, right? So if you have one centralized system, you can know exactly which business unit has how many requests and has to pay what share of the price, essentially. Yeah, so wrapping it up, API management is changing. So the maturity and the ability to execute will become a competitive differentiator. Right? So that is why it's becoming strategic. It earns money in the future. And federated API management is the pattern that does solve the challenges associated with API sprawl, with management sprawl, with platform sprawl. And if you are looking to implement federated API management, then make sure you choose the right control plane, because that is essentially the make it or break it. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Marcus. So this is a subject very dear to my heart, the nature of the changing nature of the industry that we're in, the evolution. I'll add one thing to your space. You're thinking very much in terms of the enterprise having lots of different APIs that they're providing outwards to customers. The other thing that I think companies have tended to forget, organizations are forgetting, is they're also consuming vast numbers of APIs from third parties, which will have their own policies, their own security, their own cost implications. And I think we're reaching a world where now, you mentioned accounting and sourcing. They're becoming real players in the API space around, if we have an SLA, what are we doing with that? What does it mean to the business?
Yeah, I think when you have a full-featured control plane, then the API catalog is a big aspect of that. And the API catalog should not be limited to the APIs that you run, but you should also be able to add third-party APIs that you use to the same catalog. And then, of course, you have like two options. Either you proxy them going out, so if you want to report or you want to check on a number of requests and so on, or you have to get the data from the third party. But what you can do always is you can always check the quality and the security, because you do have access to the specification. And you can just do what probably or hopefully everyone in the room does for his own APIs, lint them, check them, right? Is it syntactically correct? Are there insecure settings in my specification file? And you could do the very same for every third-party API as well.
And I strongly recommend that, using a product like API Metrics from API Metrics. But that's a separate issue. That's enough plugging. Any questions for Marcus? Can I just get the microphone to you quickly? It doesn't go on the recording now.
I'm Eric. Thanks. Of course, I like it. I have to, I guess. But the question I have, could you just say a few words? I mean, some of the data planes have different capabilities, right? So the control plane kind of has to make some compromises or some abstraction layer. How are you approaching that general problem of abstraction layers? Right?
Yeah, so I mean, the obvious solution would be to use the smallest common denominator, which is also the worst solution that you can actually use. Yeah, basically, you need a control plane that is able to do all these translations, also on a concept level. So let's take an example. There are some API platforms out there that don't have the concept of a plan, right, or of usage limitation. And if they have, they might be global for the whole application, or they might be for the combination of an application and an API and so on. So a lot are different capabilities, and they are look different. So what we opted for in our control plane is that we built our mental model like how would we like to work, right? So what are we expecting as users of the system from the system? And then we went ahead and tried to find workarounds in the different platforms to make that work. So, for example, we do create entities in the different gateways that you wouldn't do normally, just to make sure that we have something to attach that plans to, for example. So I think that's the hardest part of the control plane, to do these translations, to do these conceptual mappings, because it's not just one API left, one API right, and it's one-to-one. So I think you have to work on the conceptual level there as well.
No, I very much like the concept of the control plane synthesizing different data sources. And if you start to extrapolate into all the different layers that come into a modern API platform, if you look at something like open banking, you've got multiple layers of aggregators, third-party services, different gateways, often internal and external ones, and it makes it a very complex thing to manage. Anyway, thank you again. A round of applause for Marcus. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you.